Greetings and welcome to Black Religion Books, the official podcast of the African and Diasporic Religious Studies Association. Find out more about us and our work at ADRSA.org. I am your host, Iya Funlayo, PhD, the founding director of the ADRSA, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Professor Carlos Decena, who is the author of Circuits of the Sacred and chair of Latino and Hispanic Caribbean Studies, as well as an associate professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick. He is the editor, along with Margaret Gray, of The Border Next Door, New York Migraciones, and the author of two books, Tacit Subjects, Belonging and Same-Sex Desire in Dominican Immigrant Men, and the book we'll be discussing today, Circuits of the Sacred, A Fagotology in the Black Latinx Caribbean. So we're definitely going to come back and speak about the title and how it came to be. But first, so beautifully, first of all, thank you for being here and for constructing such a beautiful book. The structure is deep and poetic. And we'll get more into that about the structure as well. But one thing that's so beautiful is that you note how deeply biographical this work is. And this is very important work, especially given our current climates of attacks on people of color, on attacks on the queer community, attacks on the immigrant communities. And so I think that uplifting our stories in this climate is particularly important. And you beautifully weave memoir with ethnography. And you note that it required grappling with the different parts of your life and how they could be examined and reflected on together, which I thought was so lovely. You lift up the scholar my Haitian sister, Gina Athena Ulisses' concept of ressemblage, our gathering together. And so I would love to start with you telling us a little bit about your assemblage, your gathering together, your background, where you grew up, what led you to the studies that you're doing, and also what led you to writing the book.
Well, first of all, thank you, Iya Funlayo. I'm a fan. I have been a fan for a very long time.
Mm,
I've known you and your work before. I think you started some of the more activist side of the work. I recall meeting you, encountering your image in a film about the Oshun rituals in Nigeria. That
yes.
was part of a religious series, PBS, I think.
Yes, it was like
Yes.
Sacred Journeys.
Yeah, Sacred Journeys. And I recall you distinctly because not only because you were there, but also a good sister of mine, Sandy Placido, was on that film, if I recall
Mm,
correctly.
yes,
Um,
that's me, hermana. We did
yes.
Harvard together.
So,
Beautiful.
for me, it's a true pleasure and honor to be having this dialogue with you as a comrade and as an elder and as a mentor, whom I've considered you to be, which I've considered you to be from afar for a very long
Oh,
time.
gosh.
Um, so let me tell you a little bit about the book. The book was took a good long time in making because it took about 12 years, I would say, um, because it emerges out of a very big existential crisis that I experienced upon earning tenure, um, and realizing that I had quote unquote
Mm,
made it as an academic, but yet I was not clear of what this project of the academy was for. Um, I I didn't really understand the existential dimension of the work I was trying to do. How you know who was this going to help other than fellow academics? With whom was I going to be in dialogue? And so, as you probably know, like many academics, I went through a whole post tenure depression, um, with a lot of questions, and that a lot of the process led me to do a lot of introspection on my own life and the elements of it that I had had to, I felt I had to sacrifice in one way or another to quote unquote make it. Um, that process
Mm.
conjoined a somewhat parallel process of beginning to reconnect with my roots as a Catholic, kind of renegade Catholic. Um, and It was at this incredible Black transnational feminist retreat in Santo Domingo in I want to say 2013, 2014, um, that led, among other people, by Ana Maureen Lara, whom you probably know, and Alay Reyes Santos. There were a lot of people there. Alexis Pauline Gums was there. Um, Omisheke Tinsley was there. Matt Richardson was there. Um, and that becomes the space in which I encounter Santeria for the first time. Mind you,
Mm.
um, I had encountered or flirted with the religion in a way through the work of very good friends who were doing sociological research on it. Um, but I had a very studied. I held my distance. I think some of it was um, ignorance. Some of it was that I just wasn't ready to hear what I needed to hear. And
Mm.
it was during this trip that things began to change, and eventually, in the process of like my journey to initiation, which took a few years. Um, I realized that I wanted to write about this, and but I wasn't sure of how I would do it. And so the process took a while. I began writing things in that more academic way over the years. And then in 2019, I went on a sabbatical after having
Mhm.
done administration for a long time. And I began to face a bit of the challenge of being really honest about the way I wanted to do this. I had written the five more quote unquote academic pieces um, of the book, and then as I did an inventory, I this is the second time I write a book like this, so I knew the process would generate something once I did this sort of inventory. Where are things, right? Something began to happen, and that something became the integration of the academic with the experiential, and me kind of facing the music and the reality that I needed to address my own path as a working class queer Black person who doesn't present as Black, but who's nevertheless had a very long journey um, as a Dominican American, as a working class person growing up in the inner city, and somebody who's experienced upward mobility through higher education, with really looking back, grappling with the wreckage of family life, my family life, and bringing that into the work of um, producing a book that's sort of a holding place for not just for myself but for other folks. I always
Mm.
like to say that I sort of learned this in the process of writing the book, that I'm very busy. You know how Audre Lorde said that she's busy doing her work, and I really I see myself as being very busy in the process of becoming an ancestor. And I tell my
Mm.
students this.
Mm.
I see the mission of what we do as academics, as intellectuals, and as cultural workers, as and as spiritual folk, as really having that as a horizon. We are trying to create artifacts that can outlive our very finite lives, and
Yeah.
that can give sustenance to the. I always think of them as the queer Black children of the future, and that's really where I see the work. And so it took me a minute to kind of come to that realization, but now it kind of crystallizes into the book, into that form, I'm very happy um, to see it move in the world, and very pleased to be here to share it with the audience that I know will want to be in dialogue with the book.
Thank you so much for that. And you've already touched on so many different points. I mean, the aspect of upward mobility for people of color and the way that, as you mentioned, it can deracinate us, it can throw
Yeah.
us into this cultural questioning. It reminds me of Anthony Jack's work on the privileged poor and how we often don't think about how upward mobility is going to affect us, as you said, existentially, and how we feel separated from our communities. You speak a bit about that, how we feel the pressure to perform a certain way and to present a certain way and um, to not present ourselves in our fullness. And so it's really important for us to understand how these things are at play, because often we don't really even understand the mechanisms that are working. And we think, as you mentioned, that when we get tenure or when we get to this level or that level, or that there's some magical place that we're going to get to where we'll just feel like, yes, we've made it and that's it. And we get there and we find that that's not the case. Right. And so it's so important that you touch on all of these issues. The structure of the book, I mean, I can see the amount of work that went into it. You weave back and forth between poetry, between prayer, memoir, deep analysis. It's not an easy read. It's a beautifully dense read. There are moments I felt myself accelerating at certain moments when I was taking in the beautiful kind of vignettes that you provide of your childhood and beyond, and then having to, of course, slow down in those places where you go into the deeper analysis. And you say that as you wrote the book, you were wanting to interrupt the desire to know and to master, and instead encourage the reader to simply listen, right? Listen to what you've written, listen to those whose voices you're amplifying. Talk to us a bit about that concept of listening, that concept of taking in and not seeking to master, because that was an important point an entry point for us.
Well, um, that's a very that is, I think, one of the two or three really key um, takeaways from the book um, at a methodological level, at an epistemological level. Um, the insight, that notion of really not wanting to, not needing to know, was something that I had learned first from music. I went
Mm,
to I became a student of classical music very late. As you know, in these traditions, the European traditions anyway, if you're not playing Chopin piano concertos by the time you're three, you're late. Um, and so
right.
I started the piano at age 12. Um, and and I'm kind of a frustrated pianist, but that's a different podcast. But um, one of the things I learned through my my learning to become a musician is that there's a lot of repetition, that mastery is never absolute,
Mm,
because you may learn something and it falls apart the moment you have an audience in front of you. So I had that sensitivity to that. I also developed that in the process of, if not learning to play, learning to listen. There was always something new that you were going to learn with repeated listening. Um, and as I became a qualitative research person, an ethnographer, anthropologist, though I come at this from public health because I did a lot of work in the HIV research area. Um, by the time I arrived at writing my first book, I really leaned heavily on the notion of not just looking at transcripts, but listening to what my participants were saying. So it was really when I became an aleo and began to interact with elders, and began to understand how much I could really not know because I did not the
Mm,
requisite levels of um, initiation, right? That I saw the line through from what I had learned in music to what I was learning in ritual and what I was learning in my religious family. Um, and also, I think that the way we begin to think about mediumship depends. Some of us are very skilled at seeing things. I happen to hear, right? So I am very orally oriented person, and if I'm gonna sense something is going on, it's because I'm feeling something that is auditory, right? Um, and as I wrote the book, I realized that in a way, um, what I was trying to realize through that poetic language of the book was closer to a music score in a way
mm,
that could be sung or that could be heard. Not always, of course, because when you're doing transnational, I mean, wrapping your brain or wrapping your mouth around some of these more academic terms is not particularly poetic, but there's there's a mixed bag of everything in there, um, and I so I encourage the reader to do that imagining, but as a way of realizing that vision myself, I recorded the book. So there's an audible version of the book that I recorded
mm,
myself because I was really committed to realize some of the crazier things that I do in the book. As you know, the side by side narration. I'll tell you about that at some point. But um, I really wanted to realize um, a notion of listening um, as part of how we come to not only to understand better, but also, and most importantly, rub up against that which we cannot understand fully, and actually derive joy and pleasure from that not knowing, so that we're able to come back to that well. Because there's so much of what we learn, when we hear a pataki in a process of divination, the pataki always says much more than we can really grasp at
right.
any one point. And it's always true, right? But it's not true in a way that is going to tell us what like the lottery ticket is going to be, or it's not in that superstitious way. It's true in a mystical way. And how we kind of reach that depends a lot on life experience. And it depends on the moment, which is
Mm,
why, when you write down your libretas, you kind of read them and reread them, and oftentimes our mentors and elders tell us certain things over and over. It may not register now, but it registers in a month,
right.
and then you
And you
make the
take
connection.
something new each time you go back to it.
Yes, yes, and so that's kind of where the line through comes for me. Um, I also find it tremendously pleasurable to actually listen to what people say, um, and think with what people say. There's a music to it, and so I kind of aspire my writing to do that work for readers.
Mm, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. And it's so important as ethnographers in particular and as researchers to listen and to not go in with our preconceived notions of what we think we're going to find or what we expect to be said or what we desire to be said to fit whatever narrative we've already composed, but really to listen. And I appreciated your conversation about how you became a student of music, and it definitely shines through, even in as I was talking about the tempo of reading going back and forth, it gives you that tempo of music with crescendos and downbeats and all of that, which really makes it a pleasurable read. I want to step back to the title and to this term that you coined for the title, fagotology, because you reclaim this word that many people find offensive, that many people have also reclaimed as power. And we can think of it in the same kind of vein as the N word, right? How certain people have reclaimed it and use it as empowerment, and others still find it highly offensive. You mentioned as well that one of your mentors helped you to crystallize this term. So speak to me a bit about that. Why the choice of this particular word? What's the power that it holds? And what are some of the challenges that you've had in using it in this work?
When I'm a product of the growth and development of queer studies alongside LGBTQI movements, right? I come into those fields as a gay man, but also I come as to those fields as someone who was very involved in the AIDS research field and research and activism, but much more research for me. Um, as a kind of second generation man in the AIDS crisis, somebody who comes at who comes out and becomes part of cis gay male communities in a moment when the massive deaths of the earlier phase had they were recent memories, but they were not directly touching me. Certainly not in the way that they touched my immediate elders. Um, and so as somebody who is in these fields of theory, um, I thought, well, the queer stuff is really nice, and um, queer this, queer that. I think we've come to a point in the development of some of these fields that some of the language loses a bit of the value that it has in
Mhm.
achieving not just shock value, but also the very kind of edge that we want for the work, right? So I began to call this book a queer spiritology early on, and I thought I wasn't really that pleased with it, but I knew that I had read the work of Peter Savastano, who's a scholar of religion, who talks about queer spiritology. And I thought, okay, well, this is going to be that a little bit of what Peter is theorizing. But then I began to think more about the fact that so much of what I uphold and of what I think from are the lesser reputable parts of queer life.
Mhm.
That I am that one of the reasons that Santeria and Santeria communities became a home for me um, is because of their openness with of course with nuance to expressions of queerness and the leadership and vision of queer people, trans people, so that it, of course, in not in uncomplicated ways, but definitely there in ways that are unthinkable in other traditions. I mean, certainly Catholicism, which is the one that I'm most familiar with. And so I thought, well, am I writing? Who am I writing for? And who am I writing for? And where am I writing from?
Mhm.
Um, I knew I wasn't writing an ethnography. I knew that early on, and I was very clear that I would need to be practicing for at least 20 years before I felt that I could say something with some measure of authority. And I know people do it with less time, but to me, it felt like there's a lot of writing that is ethnographic on Santeria. That is not what I want to do. That writing is important for me to. It is important for me to be in dialogue with them, but that's not what I'm doing. Um, I then began to realize that a lot of the thinkers and the theorists and the artists with whom I was thinking were dissident, queer, feminist, black feminists. Those were the people with whom I was vibing as I moved through the process of writing this book. And so it was in the process of and actually it was in dialogue with Black feminists that, like Gina, like Alexis, like people like that I just thought, I'm gonna let this be what it needs to be as a product. I'm gonna let myself be free as a thinker. Um, and as I began to talk it through as it evolved, right? Because it took me a while to figure out the structure. There was a lot of revision, there was a lot of moving pieces around. Um, I was having a conversation with one of my mentors, and he was the one who sort of said, yeah, and you're doing a phagontology. It just, sort of as a side comment. He read it, and we were just, and I said, wait, I've been doing this. Okay, so what does it mean that that's what I'm doing? Um, to me, phagontology means, and this is where I think I the book is at its most heretical. Um, it's a mechanism to or a heuristic, a frame to think the divine through the profane, through the disreputable. As queer people, many of us feel that by being who we are, we end up or have ended up being exiled from religious communities, from access to the sacred, from any notion of the sacred that validates who we are, what makes us um, not just valuable human beings, but what pleasures define our sense of access to that which is the most ineffable, right? We can call it Olodumare, God, whatever we may call it. Um, and I began to think, well, okay, if theology is this study of this field that brings together different approaches to the study of the divine, of the sacred, across cultures and across times, what might it mean to think the divine with the profane, right, and the disreputable in a sustained and rigorous way? And that's where phagontology comes in. I didn't want it to be um, a nice thing about how queer people are accepted in Santeria. I didn't want this to be some exercise in how the rainbow flag is shown in some Santeria. And like that, to me, that I think that work is valuable and important. No shade on that work, but my project, the project of what I see as the project of phallotology, is to the degree that it can be revolutionary. I think it leans very heavily on upholding that which many of our traditions consider the most abhorrent as precisely the point of entry for thinking through how we how we get to free, how we reach a measure of freedom, how we reconcile the traditions with how we live, with how we love, with how we lust, right? And also our sense of how we touch. I use a phrase something like the touch of the divine in the gutter, and I really do think that there is something to that. Um, the reception, interesting. I had some. I don't have an X account. I never have had one. When it was Twitter or X, whatever. But I don't know if you're aware of this, but Duke has this practice of announcing a forthcoming book by posting the first chapter of it on X, and they did this with my book. And so, yes. And so I had some very
I can
strange,
only imagine.
I had some very strange emails over that weekend, and I began to think something's going on here. Um, and then, indeed, on Monday, so I think it started on a Thursday or something, and so by Monday, Duke was writing to me, basically saying you've had some negative um, they call it negative traffic on Twitter or something like that. And I'm like, oh Lord, what is it? And um, the book was not out. Um, I suddenly thought, oh my God, what are they saying? And of course, I eventually had a friend take a look because I wasn't going to create a Twitter account to get into this, to figure this out. Because I was like, if I'm going to be traumatized, let it be by, somebody to. So a friend went through it, and a lot of the issues were related to this word. The so now we can say phagothology. So it became this like culture war thing, which is, of course, taking it out of context. I was asked to do these interviews, which of course I declined, and I even ended up having to, talk to deans and get some advice from the university about how to handle myself. I definitely did not respond, um, but I know that that was one of the flare ups around
Mhm.
the word. I have heard from friends who are my generation and have younger children, younger progressive children, or just in people in their 20s and 30s, that they are triggered by the word. And see, and I understand that, but at the same time, um, part of the work of thinking critically about terms is um, having the opportunity to discuss the kind of discursive work that they do. And I grew up among a generation of men who were deploying terms to resignify them, right? To own them, to take ownership of them, and to sort of express power through them.
Mhm.
And we see now what the right has been able to do with a lot of the terms we invented. I mean, they've been able to resignify and they've been able to toxify them to a point where we need to be rethinking terms and how we're going to deploy terms now. So I see it as that kind of work.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it'll be very interesting to see as we go into the future, particularly in this moment, um, how how committed we will continue to be as daring as we need to be for purposes of achieving the goal of the work. Because clearly, shock value is part of it, but it's also like I didn't come into the academy to do reputable work. I didn't come I didn't come into the academy to be safe, right?
Mm,
And
mm,
I know it's comforting to come up with terms that make things sound nice, but sometimes you need jarring terms, and especially if they're terms that do important work.
right.
In this case, for me, really highlighting that oftentimes what is most obscene is not necessarily what is most perverse. It may be what reads as working class, what reads as déclassé, what reads as black, right? And that it's precisely by pointing to those practices as practices of power and freedom, right? That we can think together about how to best continue the work of liberation, which
Mm,
hasn't ended, right? Just because we're under assault now, don't mean that we're done.
not at all.
We're still, and the fight towards freedom, right, is a long one, and it requires that we kind of experience the vicissitudes of political work in a way that the people who came before did for us, right?
Mhm.
And I'm excited to see how this comes back, how others take it up, how the children take it up. I worry more about the children than I worry about anybody because
Right.
they're the ones who are going to be here after we're gone, right? They're the ones who are going to take the work forward and continue to open up space for us to be even more queer than than I can be or than anybody can be right now because they will have the imagination that their political moment and their historical moment will give them, right? Which is different from the ones that are accessible to us.
Mm, mm, mm. Wow, so powerful. I mean, and very much this point of not coming into the academy to be safe. The academy was the place, and I say was, and I'm hoping still is, and becomes again the place to be radical, right? The place to question ideas, the place to push back, push against power. We know that so many of our liberation movements started amongst college students and continue amongst them. We see even now the activism and, of course, how people are being penalized for it, for fighting back and for pushing back. And I think that this idea of shock value is important too. There's that place that wakes you up when you see something, especially because of the way we are wired to pay attention to certain things. When we are activated by certain terms or we're activated by ways of phrasing things, there's a place that caused us to sit up and pay attention. So when you see this title, when you see this book, you're going to pay attention for whichever side of the discussion you're on. You're going to be curious to see what this is all about, and I certainly was, and was I'd like want to get into a little bit of the meat of it because there's so much that you share here. You mentioned the structure of your side by side narratives, and you start that out in chapter one. First of all, I love your chapter titles as well. I'm like so for a good title. So the first chapter, Remembered Life, a composition for Egun, you juxtapose the a prayer for the ancestors with your own memoir and thinking about growing up, thinking about the victimization, right, that you faced as a queer kid, as well as the safety that you found. Talk to us a little bit about that, those that juxtaposition between safety and threat, that place where you found yourself kind of straddling that line, and what that instilled in you, and how this is also a love letter to your young self as much as it is to those who are coming later.
Yeah, it's funny. I hear you describe it, and I get emotional. And in fact, when I read that chapter out loud, I still get very emotional because um, that chapter is about the queer child as an ancestor. And I had a moment like this in my first book, um, where I was channeling a bit of the stories that many of the men I interviewed told about the queer children they knew and the queer children they were, and that sense of sadness over what those creatures experienced, those small people experienced, and how and what many continue to experience. Um, so I thought that it took me a while to realize that the Egun figure that I was really invoking was that younger self.
Mm.
Um, that took a while. I knew that I wanted to open in ritual fashion with the naming, um, and and I started. A lot of this was guided by intuition. I have to say, I was really guided by spirit in writing a lot of these pieces, and then they began to fall in different places, right? Or not fall, maybe settle in different places of the narrative structure. Um, I thought being guided by ritual was a really good way of structuring the whole book, but also of anchoring readers, sort of inviting readers to imbibe, if you will, the beauty of of ritual, of reading as a kind of almost like a prayer, like a kind of because that first section is like a prayer,
Mhm.
an opening prayer, and so there are a lot of elements that came together there, but particularly the musical ones were very important. Um, growing up in Santo Domingo in a moment um, when the anti-Haitianism that is so central to how everyone experiences Dominican life today wasn't as pronounced. Um, Growing up in a working class neighborhood where to be a man was to be out on the street, and to be a man was to be strong and firm and upright in ways that that younger self couldn't perform, right? Um, I don't have access to how tough that was, but I do have a recollection of a sense of being vulnerable, and being desperate to find um, spaces where I could be. And for
Mm,
me, those spaces were very much tethered to books. They
mhm,
were tethered to. I began to, I was an altar boy for a bit. I was around older women. They provided me with sense of validation, but also a sense of safety. Like I knew if I was with those ladies, I nobody was going to touch me.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
I was very effeminate, and so um, I felt that I could not really be out of my house
mm,
unless I did very specific things, like I would go to the bodega and run errands, but I couldn't just hang out
right,
because that was an invitation potentially to some people commenting, usually indirectly, because Dominicans are really good at indirection.
right.
So they'll
You
say
talked
things
about
about a third
comments
person.
about your walk,
Yep,
camina bien, or walk
yep.
well, or walk right, and
And it's usually
just
done in a
something
third
as simple as
person.
a child walking, right?
Yeah, some of the commentary would always be about somebody, but they would it's a third person, but there's always the um it would always be done loud enough so that you would hear, and then you
Right,
have to kind of ignore. Um, and work very delicately to make sure that nobody can um, sense that you are bothered by it.
that you're
And so that,
reacting to it. Mm,
yes. And so it's a, I mean, and it's funny because I see it in ways as not unrelated to a certain. It's almost like being like catcalling, almost like a kind of queer catcalling. I saw what very effeminate queer folk would go through, which was not fun to watch. But I didn't have the other than my sense that I could be imperiled, right? Um, my impulse was really to just try to get by, and find those spaces of safety. So that chapter very much captures a bit of that process, um, and the desperate longing to not be or what I would become, right? To not feel what I felt, and it to me it's I look back and it's I keep thinking I'm raising two boys, and I'm just hoping that to them I am a more kind of open and liberating parent than my parents could be to me. And my parents did their best, right, with all of the limited resources that they had. But it's I think it was really important to anchor the intervention in that sense of like this is what I'm trying to escape from.
mm,
Um, at, kind of at an existential level, and the process of uh, immigration to the U.S. and the quest for upward mobility had a lot to do with these initial scenes because they're an effort to run away from that queer boy, right?
mm,
To run away and not look back,
mm,
and to run away even after coming out of the closet, to run away from that sense of vulnerability and of openness to the world. And if something, I mean, for me, Santeria is initiation, that process um, taught me a lot about how about being okay with openness, being okay with vulnerability, being okay with um, allowing the ineffable to move through your body. And it's an incredible life lesson. I always say, if I ever had to be initiated again, I would do it in a heartbeat, because it was the most incredibly glorious experience of my life. It was the
Mm,
hardest, but it's the most glorious experience because of that sense of openness, that radical openness at being the rebirth that it is.
yes, the shedding and the
Yes,
rebirth into something new and more
yes,
powerful and more sacred, as you speak about this sense of queerness as alienation from the sacred, often are being told that we are abominations, and that we are not able to embody the sacred in the same way that others are. And I want to jump forward a little bit to these chapters where you really get into talking about Santeria, talking about what it does, talking about the transnationalism, because you do a lot of work here in so many ways, and talking about these internal states and what people gain from being able to be a part of these religious community, that while, as you point out, there is often ambivalence, sometimes people couch the acceptance of queerness and Santeria as being like, oh, it's so open and everybody just accepts you. And as you point out, and as other scholars have pointed out, there's really more ambivalence about it, more accepting but still admonishing on certain levels, and so that can be a complicated dance. But you also talk about some of the physical commodities, and you particularly in chapter 4, you go to challenge the conventional views of commodity fetishism and shed light on the nature of the transnational practice of Santeria. So, for those who may not be familiar, talk to us just a little bit about what that conventional view of commodity fetishism is and how you disrupt it in talking about queer folks moving through their transnational experiences of practicing Santeria.
so the one of the key questions that came up for me at a crucial point in the thinking and the conceptualizing of the study was the question of whether or not ritual objects are commodities, and if they're commodities, what kind of commodities are they? Okay,
Mhm.
so that was sort of a guiding initial question. um, the commodity, the way Marx talks about the fetishism of the commodity, usually comes from the notion, he talks very much about the sensual qualities of the commodity, which obscure the labor that goes into the making of a product, but product X or Y, right? Could be a pencil, could be something else. A commodity is an object, right? That's created through human labor, and that's put in the market in a way that replaces the labor of workers for the labor of workers and the value of objects in themselves for the value that objects acquire in a market in exchange, right? So that's how Marx sort of talks about the shift or the bridging between what's called use value, which is the value that a commodity derives from our use. Say, I'm using the pencil, I am writing with the pencil, or I am using the computer. And exchange value, which is the value that commodities accrue simply by their circulation in the market, right? So religious objects like otaces, like beads, bead necklaces, or fundamentos, or all these other objects, could theoretically be viewed as commodities in that traditional sense. But there's a problem.
Mhm.
Um, and it's a problem that has to do with the way in which Santeria, like other Afro diasporic religions, are kind of engaging fully with the notion of commodity fetishism, but as a mechanism to revise notions of commodity fetishism, which is actually what I argue. You know, these ritual objects like otases, like the sacred stones, do. Um, and in this sense, I am not really that far from people like M. Jackie Alexander, who talk about how the presumed work of the commodity is to erase in the process of exchange the not only the labor but the intention that
Mhm.
is brought to the making of the commodity, right? We know that in Santeria ritual, intention is crucial. It's like the thing. It's not, you cannot um in initiation, you have to, a baba or a ya are always going to make sure that all of intentions, that is, all of the wills, all of the desire of a congregation, to bless an iyawo, or to bless an alay, or to bless an object for handing it over to before handing it over to that person, all of that has to align, because if it doesn't align, there's something wrong with the ritual. So there's a lot of process orientation. It's, I think Santeria is one of the most feminist religions out there, because we're all about process, right? And so it's, the process has to go without a hitch, and
Mhm.
that means you're checking process at different steps, and you're not just checking your own intuition. Tira coco, you actually got to
Mhm.
check, you got to check with the
Right, you're
spirits.
actually
You got to
verifying.
you got to
Mhm.
verify to make sure that the spiritual alignment is there, so
Right.
that the realization of the sacralization of objects is complete. So that particular focus on process, to me, suggests that something different is going on with these objects. That these are not just objects that leave a factory. Though at the same time, what makes this complicated is that, Santeria, like many transnational religions, are very deeply embedded in commerce, exchange, and all of these. So it's like, it's not like we are providing in religious spaces that are pure, right? Or abstracted
Or
from
detached
uh,
from
or
these
detached
larger
from the
systems.
market, right?
Mhm.
But instead, that fundamentally, it's a mess, right? And we are in that mess. And part of the way that we negotiate the exchanges, the necessary entanglements with capitalism, right, is through processes that both um, that both validate how different these religious practices are, but that are not anathema to the vagaries of the market. When you perform religious labor, you get paid, and the Baba says, or the Ya says, derecho es so much money, or whatever it is. There is a payment. There's a recognition of labor, and it's important to underline that it's not just a recognition of labor, but you have to also recognize it in a way that ensures the intentionality aligns,
Mhm.
so that you
And that there's a
produce the
reciprocity present
right,
as well.
and the
Mhm.
blessings, so that the blessings flow. The blessings operate as a kind of energetic force, right? You don't want to bring people, you don't want to make people unhappy in the process of ritual, and
Right.
you want to make sure that everybody is engaged and derives satisfaction, right, from the part of the process that belongs to them. And in order to do that, you don't only do it through um, the ritual practice itself, but you do it through a collective process um, that 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 adjusts, or that navigates, right? Um, Labor, that recognizes labor, that validates labor, and that validates it as part of how you build community. So you're not just doing something for this person, but you're really, really doing it for the Orishas. You're really doing it for the gods, right? These are offerings, right? But we got to eat. People got to eat. And there is that recognition. Um, I find that you know, a lot of the thinking, for example, in people who write about religious tourism, right, sometimes loses sight of how religious tourism is not just any kind of tourism. It's embedded in transnational relations in a way that is messier, precisely because of these elements that Marxist uh, Marxist theory and also regular market theory do
Doesn't
not
account
account for
for.
very use, right, because there are all these other elements that are brought to bear in that process. And that chapter addresses that, but it does it through a story of these stones disappearing and trying to think through what it is um, that the disappearance of these objects, which are ritual objects, how it shows or how it reveals certain things about the dynamics in which the stone, the sacralization of the stones is embedded. What is it about these relationships that appears? What is this about? What is it about my relationship with my What is it about my relationship with my sense of myself as an Iyawo at the time? What is it about transnationality and the messiness of having religious families across boundaries when the asymmetries of power and income are so marked and are so uh, are so intense, are so incredibly often you know challenging to the notion, to any notion of pure access to a religious practice, right? It's very easy for somebody like me who, has a research budget and can travel and can come in and out of Cuba to wax ecstatic about how happy I felt during those days. But there were a lot of people working to make that happen, and there was a derecho, and then there is a materiality and a process of really having to grapple with what it means to do this work, right, and to do this work when the asymmetries of power and access are as stark as they were for me, and as I'm sure they are for a lot of people.
And where, as well as you point out, there are intimacies as well in this way, that we are not only interacting with these ritual objects, we're interacting with one another's bodies. There's a sensuality to it. And you speak about the centrality of the material, the centrality of the body, the way that the body is acted upon in ritual space, and as well acted on upon the spirits, which I think is such an important conversation, particularly because, as you point out, so much of the way that we have been taught to experience religion in the West centers the mind, centers and decenters and desacralizes the body, to its detriment. So that's a really important thing in thinking about how these objects are activated, how these relationships are mediated through the exchange of objects. It's really, really a powerful discussion. And in chapter 5, you talk about one of the most famous objects, the mirror. And this was such a beautiful discussion of how being suspended from the use of the mirror um, is a central feature of the initiation process, and thinking about how the mirror, the gaze, and the circuits of the structure of subject formation, how people's subjectivities are formed through gaze. And what I found really powerful as well in thinking about this chapter and then going back to the first chapter, how the mirror was your object of subverting your gaze, right? As you were looking at other boys as you were grappling with those feelings, and how the mirror was your tool for being able to do that without being detected. And then now the mirror becomes this thing from which you are separated for a time. Talk to us about that, because for me, I don't know if that discussion and going back and forth after having read the first chapter and coming into this fifth chapter, it presented such a beautiful contrast.
It's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it the way that you're framing it, so I'm very grateful for you making that connection. Um, and it's funny because I've been here in Madrid, and I definitely do not use the mirror the way I used to use it when I was a
Mm,
child. So the mirror was a mechanism, a pathway to gazing and ogling and checking guys out, if you will. In a moment where I felt that any direct visual access could be a problem. And in fact, there were a lot of signature moments when I was a child, and even later when I came back to the Dominican Republic, when it was very, very clear that men uh, tended to be extremely attentive to who was looking at them.
mm,
And that they're the ones who gaze, they're the ones who catcall, but you cannot do that. You turn the gaze on them, and it can be it's not received well. And I not thankfully nothing ever happened to me, but I did observe, and I have observed over the years. I think that's a little less now of the, and this is all anecdotal, of course, but when I was a child, um, I was trying to I was trying to figure out ways to look at guys, and I couldn't do it directly. So I try to do it through whatever mirrors were accessible to me.
mm.
Um, what's interesting about the mirror of Santeria initiation is that it's about the self image, and what my madrina used to say, the how the morphology of the body changes, and how necessary it is to walk away from the imago that you have, that you hold on of yourself for a few months at least before you um, look at it again and then can notice the changes, whatever those changes are, right, in your bodily presentation. Um, and what's interesting to me was that in thinking about the chapter, I developed that side by side narrative, which I kind of I asked readers to listen to as if they were together. And actually, I in the audiobook, I realized that dream of actually having it side by side. Um, so what we did was the producer, because I told my producer I really want it this way, and he said, "Okay, well." So they pitched slightly higher one of the two narratives. I don't recall which one, and I basically read them both in in sequence, of course, and then in the editing they brought them together. And so if you listen to the audiobook, on one ear you're going to hear one, and on the other you hear the other.
Hmm.
And when I first heard
That
it,
is so powerful. I can't
wh-
wait to check that out.
when I first heard it, I thought, "Oh my God!" I've suddenly I kind of thought, "You can't hear anything," but then it registered. Oh wait, the principle here is musical. This is counterpoint. You're not supposed to hear clearly. You're supposed to try to appreciate the contours of each voice and sound.
Mm,
Um, it's like you're channeling spirit, like you're hearing different voices, and you're so it has that wonderful effect that of course you can't really appreciate on the book. You can kind of imagine it, but then when you listen to it, you really I think that is a way of kind of executing this particular way of mirroring, right? Mirroring in sound, if you will. Um, when as you know, when you go through initiation, you go through a radical process of alienation. Nobody talks to you, and then you close your eyes, and you don't open your eyes until the process is over. In the meantime, your body and your auditory senses are completely inundated of sounds. You hear the clanking of the pots. You hear the the blades brushing against your skin. You hear your clothes tearing, if there's tearing of clothes. The people washing you with herbs. You're deprived of the gaze. You're completely deprived of that, because it's almost like you're back in the womb. You're being put back in that space of birth, right? Um, and so I find that, one of the most brilliant parts of what happens in initiation, and what we are able to discern about the world, right, is precisely that openness to our limitations as embodied humans, but also the capacity of our bodies to tell us much more than what we can see, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And to tell us so much more than what we can, sort of um, apprehend in a way that is definitive, right? The gaze gives you that sense of things being somewhat definitive, um, whereas sound, the touch, and these other senses, they are expansive. They can move through our bodies, in ways that make us more aware, right, of our bodies themselves as instruments, for experiencing the world. And so I find that you know um, that there's a kind of joy in, the absence of the mirror. There's a sense of terror too, because you don't know what is going to be at the other end,
Right.
of
You don't
this.
know what you look like, and we're
And
so
yeah, you're like,
used to and accustomed to centering the visual, to
right.
centering the image that we have of ourselves.
It's a very, we live in a very ocular centric, secular culture, right?
Right.
So suddenly to be put in the, um and then, what's funny about this is, not only ocular centric, but, um if you think about these, like, important scenes in psychoanalysis, like the Lacanian, mirror stage, where the child is being held up by his mother in front of the mirror, and so the child is trying to sort of understand his separation, or her separation from her mother, but then attachment at the same time. Once you toss that whole narrative of how we come into being as one body, right? Um, my biggest realization was that I was all of the bodies that were touching me, all of the
Mhm.
hands, all of the breathing, all of this, all of the breath, all of the, what is it, all of the blessings, all of the prayer, right? um that was being that was being visited upon this body, right, to afford me to this reconnection, that, according to our own, cosmology, was sort of put on pause when we were born. We forgot that connection as we came through the womb, but the connection was there, and it's really kind of giving us that opportunity to feel direct connection, right? Whenever, ritual work on my third eye was supposed to be performed, I was supposed to just sort of, I wasn't supposed to ask questions. I wasn't supposed to look at what they were doing. I was supposed to just let the elders do what they needed to do. So I think that there is a very, kind of an about face about the mirror that happens in the narrative, where I go from the mirror as almost like my little mechanism of surveillance, so that I can check out guys out, whatever, um, in a moment where, direct glance, a direct glance, could be threatening, not so much for the other person, but for me,
Right.
right? Um, to a moment in which, um, I had to surrender to, um I had to surrender even to my own idea of who I was for the sake of becoming something other
Hmm.
and something much larger than one body.
Hmm. So powerful, so powerful. And that's, of course, why, the mirror as one of Oshun's tools, the tool of self reflection, the tool of looking and gazing back at the past, the tool of um, self discovery. So you touch on all of these things, and it's a beautiful way to kind of draw us to a conclusion as we're come to the end. The last part of the book, you talk about, do this beautiful film and analysis and creative writing analysis and touch into sex as soul work, coming into this idea of sensuality that we've been talking about and reconnection with the body, the ways that we have been de disconnected from our bodies and also disconnected from sexuality and sex as a site of sacred work or a site of soul work. And this is something that you grapple with in the last chapter. Give us a little bit about that, about what it means to reclaim the body, to reclaim sensuality, to reclaim sex and enjoyment as a part of the soul work that we do in the world,
Yeah, I thought it was really important. That's why that's
particularly
the
as queer people, I should
yeah,
add.
yeah, and I thought it was really important. Um, it's one of the reasons why I called that section the section where I actually practice the phagothology, where I actually show um, a bit of what I'm talking about when I say we need to um, uh, reclaim the gutter, reclaim the disreputable, reclaim the perverse as the mechanisms through which many of us access the divine. That's the place where we not just feel pleasure and joy, but we experience the ineffable in a direct way, right? And um, that there is nothing untoward about trying to think from that space, even though it may be a difficult place to think from, um, or it may be a place where some of our, brethren in these communities may feel uncomfortable going with us. Um, we did not. I always say that I didn't necessarily come out of the closet to be to be to shroud myself in the banner of respectability. Um, yes, it's all fine and good. It's not like, I carry my um, life as a walking porn film. That's really not the point, and a lot of people who may misread both, in good faith and in bad faith, what I'm trying to say might think that that's what I mean. I simply mean that many of us have been taught that desiring, right, something other than what society thinks is appropriate is in itself aberrant, perverse, and problematic, right? What I'm saying is that many of us actually encounter a sense of joy and and a sense of completeness and a sense of joy in fragmentation, right? And community, right? Through these practices, through these ways of being, through these ways of moving through the world. And that the task before us is to make space for all of it, not just the reputable, but the disreputable, um, as necessary parts of what make religious and other communities valuable to our lives and to our struggles, right? It's not enough to say we accept you and we welcome you. It's also important to have a moment to actually um, think through what is the value of the way that you in your communities access pleasure, think about the perverse, because oftentimes what the perverse teaches us is not necessarily that it is good in itself, but that our notion of what is normal is severely skewed, severely lacking in imagination, in lacking in other things
In
that
breadth.
folks in breadth and in creativity, right?
Mhm.
And so, I don't. This is not you know, a, 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 an argument for perversion as sort of a panacea. There's a lot of politics in, um, complicated politics in queer communities around disreputable practices, and I explore that in, particularly around barebacking. Um, this is not this is messy political turf, right, for us. Um, I Part of what I chronicle in that in those chapters in that section of the book is the fact that we as cis men moved away very early on in the AIDS crisis from a conversation about the role of joy and perversion in our lives. And we went full throttle into one, medicalization of our bodies and practices, and to an inability to actually have honest conversations about what what makes us happy sexually. And the fact of the matter that many of those practices that we suddenly began to see as problematic were precisely the practices that people were continuing to engage in, right? And that the lack of honesty about what was happening was producing further silencing,
Mhm.
to the detriment of many of us, right? Instead of talking about why we need to wear condoms all the time, it could be important. And it's a different conversation now because of PrEP and all of these other things. But the ironic thing, now we talk about this much more. But when PrEP was not available, when a lot of these innovations were not available, the the enforcement of codes around sexual behavior became also um, really implicated in extreme marginalization of anything that sounded different. There was something wrong with you if you happened not to have sex with a condom one time, or if you found, if you found it, more pleasurable to do something called, that many people call, what is it? Uh, Risk reduction, right? So you learn certain things about your partner and you make decisions about what you're going to do on the basis of an educated sort of guess about what those risks might be. And so I think that what I'm hoping this work will do, not just for cis gay male communities, but for a lot of queer communities, because all of us are dealing with these kinds of issues in one way or another, is really get us to be more honest with one another about how we live, right? But also to create spaces where we get to be non-judgmental, and really, I mean, we're not all free if it's impossible for us to have honest conversations about how we're queer and how we realize that queerness. And when we're so caught up in visiting upon each other the kind of misery, right, and the harm that normative heteronormative communities tend to visit upon us without knowing exactly what who we are and what we are about. Um, so my big invitation through the chapters is really through those chapters is to engage in sort of a collective reckoning around this, so that we may continue to pry open our own communities in ways that will be of service, not so much to people like me who kind of in one way or another have kind of figured it out. I'm more concerned about the children. I'm more concerned about the young ones, the ones that are coming up, right? Who are coming into all of this, this new ecology that's so highly mediated by technology,
Mm,
with very different sorts of knowledges, and different ways of approaching issues, and different sort of identity formations.
right.
How do we engage, everyone, right? And how do we transfer what we've learned to them? If we
Mm,
are unable to have those conversations, I'm afraid that, this is something that, we will lose, an opportunity that we will lose. But my
mm,
sense is also that the um, the urgency of the historical moment is going to, put pressure on a lot of us to continue to huddle together and come together, but in no easy way, right? But I think this may be a space to try to do that work.
mm. I think this is also a reason why we see such a resurgence, right, of it within African spirituality, within Santeria, within these formations that allow us more room, while not perfect by any means, that allow us more room for reconnecting with ourselves and counteracting the ways in which religion has been weaponized against us to keep us in these spaces of shame, in these spaces of not being able to express pleasure, in these spaces of um, even discussion of our pleasure and sexuality only being acceptable insofar as they are medicalized or spoken about in ways of harm reduction or things of that nature, where we're not centering that soul work, that place of connection, that place of sacredness. And so it's such an important discussion. And I appreciate you. I appreciate all the time that we have spent together today. Time really flies when you're having fun, and it's so deep. We could talk about this book for a long time, and I hope that folks will read it and will experience all of its beautiful tempos and nuances. Tell us just a sentence about what you are working on next, what you're doing now, and also where people can connect with you if they'd like uh, to connect with you and more of what you do.
Well, right now I'm starting. I have two projects moving forward. One of them is a novel, and so I'm working on that. And there's a second project that's more of an academic project, trying to think through the some of the what I mentioned it to you earlier before we spoke. Before we started. Um, I'm really interested in the figures and ghosts that are haunting uh, the the white supremacist imagination of the new ecology of the right that we're all experiencing now. Particularly interested in understanding better what are these deep voids that many of these figureheads are trying to think through and activating around, because many of them don't actually name uh, the whole or the absence. They simply sort of articulate furiously around it. And so um, I'm going to be spending some time. I've been spending time, doom scrolling like many of us, but I've also been trying to spend time thinking about having conversations with real people out in areas dominated by working class folk, white folk, and people of color who have sort of turned to the right and trying to understand um, how quotidian fears about life, about suffering, and about the future get taken up by the sort of chatter class on the right, um,
Mhm.
trying to think through what those mediations are, because I think a lot of work has been done around people's the sort of false consciousness of the people who vote in certain ways, but I think this is much deeper. it needs to, we're still barely scratching the surface in thinking about what are these very powerful, particularly things like this incredibly potent anti-trans stuff that is so incredibly harmful for our community, but that fundamentally has little to do with trans people and much more to do with all of these enormous fears that people are experiencing about change.
Mhm.
And yeah, so that was way more than a sentence, but that's kind of where I'm at. It's very early in the process. In
Mhm.
terms of getting in touch with me, I'm at Rutgers University, in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and folks can access me, and also the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies. So I am multiply DEI'd in my life. Um, so anyway, the out
Right.
my
We know the
I
all of the challenges
listen,
with that right
listen.
now.
It's all over. It's all, and it's funny. I didn't realize how dangerously I was living, but that's where I'm at. And I continue to think, to be a firm believer that, that if the university is to survive, it has to survive with fields that support teaching young people how to think critically about the world they live in, irrespective of who they are, irrespective of where they come from. And those are the fields that I happen to work in. And I look forward to continue that fight in whichever way we manage to continue it. And
Yes.
I'm sure gonna try to bring phagatology one way or another into some of these other very provocative places, because why not? Why not? Like, why live safely?
Right. It's important. Like Lauren Hill says, sometimes you got to add a little seasoning so they hear you.
Oh yeah,
Right. We need
oh
to
yeah.
be, and
And
this is
it don't take
definitely
much to get them to
right.
hear us. So yeah.
This is a moment when it's so important to be heard, and when this work that you're doing is so crucial. So I thank you for the work that you're doing and wish you well as you continue. I thank all of you who have listened and been with us today. The link to the book, as well as the links to connect with Professor Decena, will be in the show notes, and we will look forward to being back with you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you for the platform.
You're so welcome.